Let's begin. Our Heavenly Father, as we turn to you in our gathering, we turn to your word, and thus we turn to your Spirit, who is our teacher, a teacher who dwells within us and then dwells in our midst as a congregation. He leads us into all truth. He leads us to the truth himself as it's been revealed in Jesus our Lord. And we pray that as those who are under his lordship and who have presented ourselves by your grace for discipleship, that we would learn at his feet from his word, and that all that we would say and do would bring glory to his name. Amen. Okay, once again, I'm sort of trying to figure out exactly where I was. So I sort of end up jumping right in. Under the larger heading now of human misery, we've been talking about separating out a direct cause and effect, that is, divine retribution against a specific individual or group, as something that we can determine independently of Scripture. So if the guy that I don't like winds up in a car accident, it would be irresponsible and unchristian of me to assume that God felt exactly the same way about him as I did, and therefore brought about his demise. I'm not separating God from it in terms of his sovereignty. I'm separating God from it in terms of how we perceive it and interpret it. Particularly in this larger context of sin and human misery, where there is a common liability to all the miseries of this life, and therefore mankind lost their communion with God and are under his wrath and curse. So we know that much, and that is more than almost anyone else on the planet who doesn't have a rudimentary idea about the Bible. They don't know even that much. This, of course, puts us in a place of humility where we belong, and it reminds us that God doesn't follow the God script, that is, the deity's job description that we typically issue to our gods or our God in order to make them more predictable and manageable, and keep them firmly on our side in our quarrels, in our conflicts, or whatever else we may need God for. So simply put, we are not permitted as Christian people to sit in on the divine council to learn God's secret will about specific incidents of human misery, at least in the details. It is enough for us to know this larger picture, to interpret life through the lens of that larger picture, and to recall that our judgment is, by definition, rather poor, particularly in matters of spiritual, invisible realities. Okay? Christians have a remarkable confidence in their own judgment, particularly the younger they are in the faith. So you young people in the faith, just recall that. Submit your judgment to wise people, and most certainly they will direct you in the right way. Well, I want to pause here now to tell a couple of stories, maybe 3, maybe 4, to go back to something I brought up earlier about how doctrine doesn't bleed. And what follows are just a few examples of what we might call ordinary human cruelties. And in each one of these stories, there are victims who suffer at the hands of their fellow human beings, though the victims themselves have not sinned in any noticeable or distinctive way that it would allow us to create some type of cause and effect. And given one of this study's organizing themes, I'm going to start with a story from the period that we call the Holocaust, one event, and this is the massacre of Ukrainian Jews at Babi Yar, which is I guess Russian for the grandmother ravine. Sort of an ironic term. Well, in the popular imagination, the Holocaust brings up mental images of the camps, whether the concentration camps or the extermination camps, the latter having killing as their primary function. But before there were really any extermination camps in the East, there were the Einsatzgruppen. These were deployment groups. And according to the Encyclopedia Britannica, for a nice brief summary definition, they were units of the Nazi security forces composed of members of the SS, the security police. I've got the German words here, but I'm not about to try and pronounce them without rehearsing ahead of time. And they acted as mobile killing units during the German invasions of Poland and the Soviet Union, which of course included Ukraine. Mobile killing units. There were 4 of them. Einsatzgruppe A, B, C, and D. And they had one main task. They were to follow the regular army as it moved east from Poland through the Baltic states and into the Soviet Union. And that main task was find, round up, and murder, quote, those perceived to be racial or political enemies who were found behind German combat lines in the occupied Soviet Union. Racial enemies, of course, were the Jews and the Roma people, the Gypsies. Political enemies were communists, because Nazis hate communists, communists hate Nazis, which is a little bit of an irony. Consider there's a common interest in socialism for both groups, but one is a nationalist socialism and the other is a worldwide brotherhood form of socialism. So they also targeted a third victim category that was neither racial nor political. They went to specific institutions to murder people who had either physical or mental disabilities. Now, locating the victims was not as difficult as it might sound, considering they've just arrived on the scene. Why do you think that is, by the way?
They're already naturally marginalized, so it shouldn't be hard to see where they're at.
Okay, there is a natural marginalization.
People pointed fingers at where to find these people.
That's exactly right. That's part of this human misery component. Wherever they went, German units were in contact with locals who cooperated in their invaders' bloody mission. So you might say, we hate cats, but we hate rats even more than we hate cats. So while you're here, and we hate you, at least get rid of the rats, meaning the people that we hate even more. Well, a German report that was dated October 2nd, 1941, contained this sentence: Operational Situation Report USSR number 101. And it provided the Home Office with a summary of Einsatzgruppe C's work in northwest Kiev, Ukraine. It said, Sonderkommando 4A, in collaboration with Einsatzgruppe HG and 2 commandos of Police Regiment South. I'm reading this on purpose, by the way, just to get this idea of this is almost technical information that's being passed up the chain of command so that the report arrives where it belongs, in Berlin. It's not quite bureaucracy speak. It is a little bit, but it's also army speak. But the next line is what captures your attention. 2 commandos of Police Regiment South executed 33,771 Jews in Kiev on September 29th and 30th, 1941. So they're, in a sentence, describing a pitiless massacre that took place over a 2-day period, during which close to 34,000 Jews, that's 17,000 per day, were shot in a ravine, one at a time. Well, Babi Yar itself, the ravine, was about 150 meters long, so a little bit longer than a football field and a half. It was about 30 meters wide and 15 meters, about 16 and a half yards, deep. So picture this kind of stretched out football field, only it's got depth to it. Goes down about 15 or 16 yards. Well, there was a man there that day named Fritz Hofer, and he was a member of Sonderkommando 4A, and he left us with an eyewitness account. Not the only one, but one of them. One day, he says, I was instructed to drive my truck outside the town. I was accompanied by a Ukrainian. Must have been about 10 o'clock. On the way, we overtook Jews carrying luggage, marching on foot in the same direction that we were traveling. There were whole families. The further we got out of town, the denser the columns became. Piles of clothing lay in large open fields. These piles of clothing were my destination. The Ukrainian showed me how to get in there. After we had stopped in the area near the piles of clothes, the truck was immediately loaded up with clothing. This was carried out by the Ukrainians. I watched what happened when the Jews, men, women, and children, arrived. The Ukrainians led them past a number of different places where one after the other they had to remove their luggage, then their coats, shoes, and overgarments, and also underwear. They also had to leave their valuables in a designated place. There was a special pile for each article of clothing. It all happened very quickly, and anyone who hesitated was kicked or pushed by the Ukrainians. I don't think it was even a minute from the time each Jew took off his coat before he was standing there completely naked. No distinction was made between men, women, and children. Once undressed, the Jews were led into the ravine. Where they reached the bottom of the ravine, they were seized by members of the Schutzpolizei and made to lie on top of Jews who had already been shot. This all happened very quickly. The corpses were literally in layers. A police marksman came along and shot each Jew in the neck with a submachine gun at the spot where he was lying. The children were kept with their mothers and shot with them. When the victims came along the paths to the ravine, and at the last moment saw the terrible scene, they cried out in terror. But at the very next moment, they were already knocked over by the packers and made to lie down with the others. The next group of people could not see this scene because it took place around a corner. Now, the compliance of the Jews can be explained by their belief that they were being resettled somewhere. Of course, that was a ruse to get them to cooperate. Now, I took that lengthy eyewitness account from a book called Becoming Evil: How Ordinary People Commit Genocide and Mass Killing. Well, I just put that in my footnote. And then I thought, what an interesting title that is. Becoming Evil: How Ordinary People Commit Genocide and Mass Killing. That opening phrase, becoming evil, in a sense assumes that they were once innocent, and perhaps, I haven't read the whole book, but maybe forces beyond their control or cultural pressures or whatever other influences were brought to bear created this sense of we are obligated now to be evil. And remember, this part of the Sunday school is about human misery and how the church has its own explanation of the way things are in the world. And so, in a sense, we would, if we could raise our hand in the public forum as the church, we could say, becoming evil? There had to have been something there to work with already in order for the people to be as evil as they were. And that's, I think, a much better explanation of events like Babi Yar. As the historian Martin Gilbert notes, the scale of the Special Task Force killings now exceeded anything previously recorded. By the end of September, in a 2-day massacre, 33,771 Jews had been murdered in the ravine at Babi Yar. So do that little math work, right? I always picture, what do 33,000 people look like when Kauffman Stadium is about 3/4 full? Just scan all the stands, you know, and the upper deck and all of that. Get an idea of what 33,000 people looks like. He goes on, and a further 35,782 Jews and communists, according to that same operational situation report, in the Black Sea cities of Nikolaev and Kherson. There were German complaints also that their work of mass murder was being obstructed. On September 28th, at Kremikug, I don't know if I have that right, the Russian mayor, Vershovsky, ordered the baptism of several hundred Jews with a view to protecting them from the slaughter. Very interesting. This now the presence of some dimension of common grace, even though it's a twisting of good theology. But the mayor was arrested and shot for his efforts. Gilbert continues, in Odessa, within 24 hours of Hitler's noonday comment, this was the comment, by exterminating this pest, the Jews, we shall do humanity a service of which our soldiers can have no idea. The mass murder began of 25,000 Jews, half of whom were locked in 4 vast warehouses, 3 of which were then set on fire. Those who were not killed by the flames and who sought to escape through holes in the roof or through windows were met with a hail of hand grenades and machine gun fire. Many women went mad, throwing their children out windows. The 4th warehouse, filled entirely with men, was then destroyed by artillery fire. Well, in the end, the Einsatzgruppen murdered close to 25% of all the Jews who were killed in the Holocaust. That is, these basically 3,000 men who were assigned to these operations were responsible for the deaths of 1/4 of the Jews killed in what we call the Holocaust. One by one, with their support troops, the local police, and the collaborators, and all with the assistance of the Wehrmacht. So, are these Jews more evil than any other Jews or Roma? I think, this is particularly moving because, don't put modern Johnson County into Eastern Europe or in Western USSR. These are little villages, farm communities, probably made up mostly of relatively poor people, shops, support organizations for agriculture and the like. And they're just living their modest, anonymous lives when an army suddenly appears, and rather than do what armies have typically done in European wars over the last few centuries before this event, that is, fight against other armies, trying to keep the civilian population separate, one of their main targets is the civilian population, so that they dedicate all of this time and all of these resources to killing civilians. Not in an indiscriminate way, like, say, bombing cities, which would happen later in the war, but by saying, oh, here are the Martins. Let's arrest all of them and bring them out here under the pretense that we are going to relocate them. And then we have men waiting for them who will one by one shoot them in the back of the head. And there are bits and pieces of film and photograph of this event. Not much, but you can actually see it, and in some sense, an eyewitness account.
Yeah, to make it, to pull it out of the Johnson County context, where maybe they can understand, well, both of these groups were minority classes that were already worked together around them. So they would speak the same language, so they were already more different, so they were an easy mark, and they had that outsider status that also made them more vulnerable.
Yeah, in fact, that's become a recent topic of historical investigation. I have a book at home that's pretty new, can't think of the title offhand, but it describes the location between Germany and, I don't know, maybe as far as Moscow, in the years leading up to the war, and how both sides are intolerant of their own Jewish populations. And so they capitalized on this existing hostility. Do you know what a pogrom is? It's when, have anyone seen Fiddler on the Roof? Right, there's a pogrom in Fiddler during the wedding when the local Russian citizens, I think they're Russian, right? Haven't seen Fiddler in decades. They're all bent out of shape about something. A rumor goes around, someone poisoned the well, and they rush into the little shtetl and tear it to pieces. And in that case, I don't think anyone is murdered, but in many cases they were in fact murdered. Pogroms were one of the reasons, indirectly I suppose, benefited American culture, because so many Jews from Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union escaped that world to come to America in the early 20th century and, provided this great cultural investment in our part of the world. So, yeah, I think that's another demonic layer in this. that the invaded communities cooperate with the invaders, not just in the typical, well, we need to get along with these guys sense, but yeah, while you're here, do us a favor and get rid of this Jewish population. Now remember the name of that book, Becoming Evil. I don't think anyone became evil. I think what happens is evil is let off the leash and people begin to act according to their own natural capacities. That is a hugely difficult problem for secularists. They have to acknowledge it, but they don't quite know how to address it because it doesn't fit into any of the typical materialistic schemes that they are contending for. For us, it's a spiritual problem, and it's been set forth very clearly in the Scriptures. And it's one reason why I'm frustrated with the church that just picks out sins and says these are the bad ones, because now it can't participate in a more responsible and constructive way with an Augustinian theology, but with a partisan way of saying there are sinners that are worse than others, and they are interfering with the quality of life that we want in our own communities. So, yeah, I think that's a misrepresentation of Christianity, but that's my own little hobby horse. So one by one, children, women, men, shot down, layers, maybe you throw some lime over one layer, some dirt, start all over again. And the reason this practice was brought to an end was its lack of efficiency, and, believe it or not, it was actually demoralizing to the people who had to do this all day long for a living. So, imagine that, yeah. Yeah. And so, in view of morale issues, it was thought wiser to begin experimenting with more efficient means of mass extermination. My parents were alive when this occurred, as were yours, and yours, and yours, probably yours. So it's not that long ago. I don't know about yours. Yeah, not that long ago. Okay, another one, and then we'll be done for today. Any questions, though, about that?
How do we respond when this way you pointed out that this becoming evil, when something bad happens, I see people like doubling down on that notion, and they'll say things like, we'll be stronger than ever, we'll recover. People are, by and large, very good, and not this type of response is what you often hear when some
Right.
tragedies happen.
Right.
And how do Christians need to just kind of wince at that? But
I think we go back to the two categories that dominate this section of the study, common grace and common curse. Because in the next story, that reality is illustrated for us in an extremely ironic way. And I'll get to that, and it'll lead back to how this strange, almost inexplicable mix of human good and evil, relatively speaking, share common territory, or share even within a single individual. I mean, who did Spielberg make famous in his Holocaust movie? Oskar Schindler, right? Anyone ever read the book Schindler's List, on which the movie was based? I mean, the guy's, he's not a good guy. Even by conventional standards, he's not a good guy. But this not very good guy, at great personal sacrifice, did a really good thing. And we have a way to explain that, if we're at least a little bit more sophisticated in our theology, because of these categories of common grace and common curse. Where the world at large, it's all kind of random. And what they want to do, perfectly understandable, is exalt the people who do good in the midst of bad and sort of try to maybe explain why the majority seems either bad or indifferent under these circumstances.
It's usually the case that when there are extraordinary acts of inhumanity, that it provokes extraordinary acts of humanity. Whenever there's a terrorist shooting and people are killed, it unites people and brings out charity in common grace in a way that's never manifest, outside of those events.
Right. But then it dissipates.
Yeah.
And I think, the desire to maintain it is always thwarted by our constant inability to get along with each other and our mutual hatreds for whatever reason, racial, ethnic, political, religious, social, academic, economic, whatever it is. But what I'm saying is Christianity can account for all of this. And I think in a credible way. Of course, if you just say, well, there's no God, well, we're out of the debate, but not many people think that way. Did anyone see Neil deGrasse Tyson? He sent out that tweet after the massacre down, and he made an observation in it, because X number of people died in El Paso, or Houston, or Dayton, right? Both Biden and Trump got those wrong. It's kind of... And he said, but also this, X number of people die per hour because of hospital infection, because of homicide, and I think the third one was drunken driving. He made no judgment on it. He just stated it, as if to say, perspective. Well, this made the Washington Post. There was an avalanche of abuse in the Twitterverse because he made this statement. And I think that is itself a testimony that we don't like Vulcans. We want the very best that rationalism and Enlightenment thinking and empiricism provide for us. But when push comes to shove, nobody can live that way. And evidenced not by the fact that people corrected him, but that they were furious at him for saying what he said in a completely non-judgmental way under the circumstances. In other words, there are social norms that are much, much stronger than rationalism and logic. I'm going to do something about that later on when... remember my Steven Pinker illustration? He's the guy who shows up on the anniversary of dating with a juicer for his girlfriend, and gives her, he worked out, he read all the reviews and he brought the very best one and reminds her how healthy eating makes for a healthy relationship, and it's their 1-year anniversary, and mom loves him, and she goes, well, yeah, I guess this is good. And all of a sudden you start hearing Bad to the Bone. And who pulls up on a Harley? Friedrich Nietzsche. And he just gives her the eye. And she's on the back of the bike heading off into the sunset before you know it. We don't like rationalism. We want romance. Romance not just in the sense of attraction between men and women, but the whole idea of the Romantic movement. We see that as affirming our humanity, not rationalism. All right. Well, that was 1940. Only a few years earlier, 40, right? Yeah. Only a few years earlier, in another part of the world, the Japanese unleashed their own demons upon the helpless population at Nanjing, almost surpassing human comprehension. So, what we're going to see here are two racially motivated massacres. One is carried out with that kind of German organization and efficiency. They are on a mission. They really see themselves as saviors of the world if they can rid the world of its Jews. That's a noble goal. And so they don't carry it out with a kind of insane madness. They carry it out with a certain determination to do what they must do to accomplish their goal. Meanwhile, in China, it's just the opposite. The Japanese are also a racially superior people. But when they're let off the leash, they go crazy in a way that is characterized by the most immoral, unimaginable kinds of sinful practices that I'm not even going to talk about in any detail because it's so, well, it's just not right for a Sunday school, I suppose. But at that time, 1937, Nanjing was the capital of China. And Japan had invaded China in the summer of 1937. After taking Shanghai, the soldiers made the close to 200-mile journey to Nanjing, which they surrounded the city. They offered the city surrender terms, but threatened no mercy if those terms were rejected. In the event, there's lots of diplomatic and military stuff going on, but in the event, the Japanese showed no mercy to the city, nor to the surrendering Chinese soldiers, nor to the city's men, women, and children. But no mercy is too polite a term to describe what happened. Some historians call this the Nanjing Massacre, but the name that best fits is probably the name that is now most commonly associated with the event, especially since Iris Chang published her book back in the 90s, The Rape of Nanking. So during a 6-week period that began on December 13th, 1937, Japanese troops basically stowed away their humanity, their basic decency, in their footlockers and gave way to their most basest desires and instincts. They're far from home, and by most accounts they had the blessing, perhaps even of a member of the emperor's family. And again, freed from those constraints, the soldiers raped, murdered, burned, looted, and tortured their way through China's capital city. And here are a few examples of what human beings, becoming evil, are capable of doing when, we'll call it, when the common grace institutions are removed, or vice versa, they are removed from common grace institutions. There were live burials. Soldiers would force one group of Chinese captives to dig a grave, a second group to bury the first, and then a third group to bury the second, and so on, and all of them were buried alive. Some victims were only partially buried, maybe only up to their chests or their necks, so that they would endure the further agony of being hacked to pieces by swords or run over by horses and tanks. There were mutilations. The Japanese not only disemboweled, decapitated, and dismembered victims, but performed even more excruciating tortures. And I should add, none of this is for any strategic military benefit. They're not trying to gain information about enemy movements or arms supplies. This is just sport. All right? They nailed prisoners to wooden boards and ran over them with tanks, crucified them to trees and electrical posts, carved long strips of flesh from them, and used them for bayonet practice. At least 100 men reportedly had their eyes gouged out and their noses and ears hacked off before being set on fire. And there was, by a number of accounts, a beheading competition. Who, between two officers, right, officers in that tradition carry the samurai sword, who could reach 100 decapitations first? It's a race. Sort of like a sack race at a picnic. Here is historian Michael Burley's summary. Once inside the city, the Japanese disregarded any distinction between combatants, civilians, and prisoners of war, which they rarely took anyway, and proceeded to indulge in an extended orgy of violence. For 3 months, others shorten that to 2 months, they were allowed to burn, murder, pillage, and rape in Nanking and its outlying villages. Looting was the most explicable crime, since the peasant soldiers of the Japanese army were poor and wanted things sent back home. And the 17 military and policemen in the city were hardly in a position to stop it. The killing is less easy to understand. Although Japanese soldiers had a sense of right and wrong, there was no transcendental moral code to offsuit the absolute dictates of officers who in turn were the unquestioning servants of the emperor. If they said kill, you killed. On one night alone, some 17,000 men and boys were slaughtered to ensure that a military parade attended by Hirohito's 50-year-old uncle, Prince Asaka, would pass off without incident. Masses of Japanese troops shouted Banzai, meaning 10,000 years, that is the duration of the emperor's reign, in the prince's honor outside the former Kuomintang national headquarters. Chinese were killed in every conceivable manner, including being crucified, savaged by dogs, bayoneted to save ammunition, or beheaded. Officers competed to see who could kill the largest numbers before their swords became too blunt. Now that's a good place to stop, but also gives us a chance to remember the premise of this part is doctrine doesn't bleed, just like statistics don't bleed. So we're taking a doctrine, human misery, and we're finding illustrations of it in fairly recent history where an innocent population becomes the victim of aggressive human beings released from, or with the permission with, ordinary authorities. What are people capable of doing?
Is that an actual question?
If you want.
We're capable of anything.
It's kind of a scary thought, isn't it? I mean, eventually, if you read this kind of history, you can't help but ask yourself, what if I were, who, am I going to stand all alone and like the guy in front of the tank in Tiananmen and say, not for me?
kind of interesting that in addition to the dangers of rationalism, the dangers of romanticism are that it sees these urges, you know, as sort of the authentic of the human, the Dionysian
Right.
impulses, and so it's unstable. I mean, romanticism starts out with the noble savage, but what it ends up with is the cruel savage.
The savage. Yeah, yeah, that's right. Yeah, because that's the underlying reality of romanticism is truth is what originates from within us and finds expression in our emotions, sometimes in the arts, but other times in ways that culture would look at, generally speaking, as rather vulgar or self-destructive. Christianity has an answer for that too, I think. Why are we, as it were, rational and irrational, not just culturally, but individually? Have you ever seen even a Christian person suddenly do something wacky against all their own belief systems and confessions and years of devotion? They just suddenly go nuts. And now I realize there's probably something behind that over a period of time, but it reminds us what we are capable of, particularly if we are not, as Paul puts it, walking in the Spirit. Okay? Well, let's stop there, and we'll pick up next week. This will only go on for 7 more weeks.
What do you think?
Piling up story after story.